Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Rotem, and today, as part of our ongoing research into Renaissance compositional processes, we will see how Thomas Wilkes borrowed material from Salomone Rossi in order to compose his first madrigals. In the context of musical composition, the line between taking inspiration from another piece, borrowing elements from it, or just plain stealing can be blurry. Today we will look at an interesting case where a composer borrowed both lyrics and musical elements from other compositions to create new ones. Putting aside any potential questions about the ethics of originality, which were very different in the past, we will look at the source materials and the pieces that were created using them, to see what we can learn about the elusive compositional process of polyphonic pieces. Let's start. In 1597, the English composer and organist Thomas Wilkes published his very first music collection in London, madrigals for 3, 4, 5, and 6 voices. In the dedication, he wrote, "These pieces are the first fruits of my barren ground, unripe in regard of time." Indeed, he was young, about 21 at the time of publication. Now, very interestingly, the madrigals for 5 parts, all 6 of them, are not completely original. They are based on 3-part canzonette by the Mantuan composer Salomone Rossi. These were published 8 years earlier in Venice, far away from London. Rossi's publication was also his first, and he was also rather young at the time it was published, possibly 19 years old. How can one transform Italian 3-part pieces into English 5-part pieces? Before looking into it, let's remind ourselves of some common practices from that period. The first is that using the same text as another composer to create your own piece became common. Of course, in the context of sacred music, it was completely normal that composers made different musical settings using the same liturgical texts. But also in the context of secular music, some beloved texts were sometimes set by several composers. For example, between 1597 and 1678, the text Cor mio de non languire by Giovanni Battista Guarrini was set differently more than 30 times. As we will see later, Rossi himself, in his canzonette, used texts he saw in the canzonette by his senior colleague in Mantua, Giovanni Giacomo Gastoldi. The second thing we should remember is that in England at the time, as we showed in our episode dedicated to translations, Italian pieces were often borrowed by English publishers and fitted with new texts in English. These were sometimes close translations and sometimes free ones, and they often included light transformation of the music. Now that we have the necessary background, we can dive in and see exactly what Wilkes did with Rossi's pieces. As we said, all the 5-part madrigals in Wilkes' publication are based on Rossi's canzonette, either only musically or both musically and textually. Let's have a look, for example, at Those Sweet Delightful Lilies. Examining the text, we see that it is not a one-to-one translation from Italian to English, but it is quite close. The beautiful roses turned into delightful lilies, nature is involved, and the last 2 lines are rather close translation of the original. Now let's see the music. Rossi's opening has a rather peculiar rhythm. I bei ligustri rose. These are copied by Wilkes. Those sweet, delightful lilies. Even if the mode and the ending of the melody are different, the rhythm and melodic shape that Wilkes chose are clearly Rossi's. Setting it in 3 voices, Rossi chooses to have the voices more or less together, in homophony. Let's listen. By the way, like always, and as was the practice in older times, when singing a cappella, we sing in the pitch which is comfortable for us. Now, Wilkes not only borrowed Rossi's text declamation and melodic contour, but also the contrapuntal way it is rendered, in homophony. He doesn't use the 5 voices all together though. He makes the 3 higher voices sing it once, and then extends it by having the 3 lower voices sing it again. Let's listen.
Those sweet, delightful lilies, those sweet, delightful lilies.
Rossi's next bit is Quin voi natura pose. This is mirrored in Wilkes with Which nature gave my Phyllis. From Wilkes' usage, it is clear that what he borrows is not the exact notes, but the rhythmic declamation and melodic profile. Rossi renders this bit using imitation, and then finishes with a cadence. Let's listen. Wilkes, following Rossi, also employs imitation, but since he has 5 voices, this segment is slightly longer. In the amazing treatise of Tomás de Santa Maria, which we have presented several times on this channel, he refers to such short musical segments which are imitated in polyphony as subjects. He even adds that beginner keyboard improvisers may extract subjects from other pieces and memorize them for later use. It seems as if Wilkes did a similar thing. He extracted Rossi's subjects for his own use. The rendition of the 3rd and 4th lines of the text, which form the B part of this piece, are very interesting. The 3rd line, albeit similar textually, was set in another way, but the 4th line includes an obvious borrowing from Rossi's piece. Let's hear Rossi's rendition of this line, where he used longer note values, as was commonly done when setting very sad or serious texts. Even if Wilkes used another mode, the borrowing of Rossi's subject is obvious. In this case, he also copied the actual entrances. First the bass leaping an octave, followed by the 2 upper voices, each in their turn leaping a 4th. However, Wilkes then extends this section following the original sad and serious spirit. The 3rd and 4th voices now entering with leaps of a 3rd, and at the end, he added a painful English false relation. Let's listen. A very similar borrowing takes place in Make Haste, Ye Lovers, originally Correte Amanti. Also here, the text has a lot of borrowed material. And also here, a lot of music was borrowed. Originally, Wilkes' setting is written a tone higher, but here I presented a tone lower to demonstrate the similarity more clearly. See how Rossi's subject of Correte turned into Make hasty lovers plaining, and see how the subject a miei sospiri turned into to see my sighs, although here Wilkes didn't use it for imitation in all the voices. The B part is also consistently borrowed, subject for subject. The first homophonic bit of Rossi became a homophonic bit in Wilkes, using very similar rhythmic declamation. The next subject is very much copied. Rossi's subject, Da milla fanni, and its counter subject in the bass, Da milla fanni, turn into His grief espying and His grief espying. Wilkes uses the 5 voices to extend this bit. and for added intensity, he even repeats it a fourth higher. Finally, the last subject, sconsolato muore, turns into comfortless is dying, and imitated further. Let's listen to this B part by both composers. Here is Rossi's setting.
Ormai questo mio cuore
And here is the setting of Wilkes.
My heart is grievous by his grievous
It is fascinating that despite the fact that so much is borrowed, it doesn't sound at all like the same piece. If we try to uncover Wilkes's process, disregarding the aspect of translating the poetry, we find that he seems to have first defined the declamation and general melody of each subject, and only then started to set them in polyphony. This might have been a nice way for a beginner composer to simplify at least some of the compositional steps. We don't know whether this was a common practice among composers, but we also find it in at least one piece by young Salomone Rossi, the composer from which Wilkes was borrowing. As we mentioned, in Rossi's Canzonette, there are 6 pieces which their text is taken from Canzonette by his senior colleague Gastoldi. Apart from using the same text, we don't find musical borrowing, except in one piece. In Ai che mi tieni il cuore, we see that Gastoldi's first voice and Rossi's second voice, if we disregard the exact location on the hexachord and some ornaments, are very similar. Ai che mi tieni il cuore. Beyond that, having first 2 voices in parallel tenth, which are then followed by a voice at the fifth above the lowest of the 2, is also borrowed by Rossi as a contrapuntal framework. Let's listen to Gastoldi's opening. And now to Rossi's. Again, using the same material can lead to results that sound rather different. So, young Wilkes used this technique to borrow from young Rossi, who in at least one case used it to borrow from Gastoldi. Can we, novice composers trying to understand the compositional process of the late Renaissance, also use this borrowing technique? Let's try. Like Wilkes, we will take a 3-part canzonetta by Rossi, and by borrowing its subjects, compose our own 5-part piece. We will, however, keep to Italian, avoiding the aspect of translating the text. The canzonetta that we will borrow from is Rossi's Vattene pur da me cruda lontano. The A part begins with a clear subject, Vattene pur da me. For the end of this section, we will only copy the text, and note that at the end of this line there is a cadence before the repetition of the A part. The short B part has Che nel mio petto ognor, and then a homophonic cadence with the rest of the text, Ti serbo e godo. The beginning of the C part starts with a very distinctive syncopated subject, Anzich'il dio d'amore, with a cadence. The last subject has 2 parts, Vuol che fuggendo, and then Mi nodrisci il core. This C part is repeated, and in its end we'll find the final cadence of the piece. Now, armed with Rossi's subjects, which we can use freely, we have, in fact, the entire plan of the piece in our hands. With it, we can compose our own setting. For notational simplicity, we will now ignore the repeats of the A and C parts. As Rossi's first subject was set using imitations, we shall do the same. I randomly started with putting our subject in the fourth voice, then the third voice, then the top voice, then the bass, and then the top voice again with a continuation of the text and a cadence. Then I enriched the entrance of the top voice with an accompaniment of the second voice, and similarly enriched the final entrance with an accompaniment of the fourth voice. All that is left is to fill all the gaps according to your liking, making sure that each voice has a nicely smooth melody in its range, and that the text is declaimed correctly every time. Since we know how cadences work, it is also possible to start from the cadence and go backward, again making sure that each voice arrived at the end with all the text. You can see, for example, how the third voice has to compress the text in order to make it on time, but it's still okay. Let's listen to our A part.
Vattene pur da me, vattene pur da me, vattene pur da me, vattene pur da me.
For the B part, I put our subject in the third and fourth voices, and then in the soprano and bass voices, with a continuation of the text and a cadence to D, the fifth degree of this mode. I intentionally used long note values to allow further entrances in the inner voices with comfortable text declamation. Then I added a stretto entrance in the second voice, and another one just after. Then I made the third voice join into the entrance of the soprano and bass. The fourth voice joined the entrance of the second voice, and then I completed the cadence in all the voices. Let's listen. For the beginning of the C part, I put the syncopated subject in the third and fourth voices, and then in the soprano, followed by the bass with a cadence to B flat, the third degree of the mode. I made the second voice accompany the bass entrance, joining the simple one-step cadence. And all that is left is just to complete the other voices. Let's listen. The last part was a bit more complicated, as our subject has two parts. But since both parts are in essence a descending third, it is possible to use them together, as also Rossi did once. In any case, the process is similar to the other sections, putting the subject in different voices and looking for a nice space that leads to the final cadence in G, the first degree of the mode. Then there was very little to complete. Let's listen to this final section. I should note that while my process might seem straightforward, when I was actually composing, there was a lot of trial and error, correcting, adjusting, trying again, etc. This is probably normal for novice composers, and hopefully it gets better with experience. It would have been amazing to get some notes from Rossi on my setting. Anyway, this was our show about borrowing and composing. We hope you enjoyed it. Many thanks to Alon Shab and Yason Marmaras for working with me on this episode. And to Giovanna, Tessa, Doron, and Jacob for singing with me. Don't forget to check the special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. If you enjoy Early Music Sources, consider supporting it on Patreon. Comment, share, and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.